The cobblestones of Benefit Street still echo with whispers of a name that Providence tried to forget. Deacon Ezra Rutherford, a man whose devotion to God became so twisted that he convinced himself the basement of his colonial home was heaven itself. Between 1762 and 1765, neighbors reported strange sounds coming from the Rutherford property. Children's voices that seemed to come from beneath the earth, crying out in languages no child should know. The sounds would begin at sunset and continue until dawn, creating melodies that resembled hymns but carried undertones that made listeners cross themselves and hurry past the house. When authorities finally broke down that basement door in March of 1765, they found evidence of rituals so disturbing that the colonial government sealed all records for over a century. What they discovered wasn't just the bodies of twin children who had never seen sunlight. Children whose skin was pale as parchment and whose eyes had adapted to eternal darkness. It was proof that sometimes the most dangerous monsters are those who believe they're saving souls. The basement contained makeshift altars, carved symbols that matched no known religious tradition, and journals filled with theological theories that justified the slow murder of innocents in the name of preservation. 3 generations of Providence families have tried to live in the Rutherford house, but none lasted more than a month. They all reported the same phenomena: children's voices singing beneath their floors, the smell of oil lamps burning in walls where no lamps existed, and the sensation of small hands touching their ankles when they walked across certain rooms. Before we continue with the story of Deacon Rutherford and the basement that became a tomb for innocence, make sure you're subscribed to our channel and hit that notification bell, because this is one story that will change how you think about devotion forever. Also, let us know in the comments what state you're listening from. We love hearing from our community of mystery lovers. The Rutherford house stood like a testament to Puritan prosperity on the hill overlooking Providence Harbor. But beneath its foundation lay secrets that would make even the strongest faith crumble into dust. Providence in 1762 was a city caught between two worlds, its very soul torn by contradictions that would define the American character for generations to come. The old Puritan values that had built the colony still held sway in the religious circles, their influence evident in the stark meeting houses and the rigid social codes that governed daily life. Yet the bustling port brought in merchants, sailors, and ideas that challenged the moral structure Roger Williams had established a century before. Ships arrived weekly from the Caribbean, their holds filled not just with molasses and rum, but with stories of cultures that lived by different rules entirely. The city of 8,000 souls thrived on what everyone knew but few openly discussed: the triangle trade that connected Providence to Africa and the Caribbean through chains of human bondage. This commerce created wealth that made some question whether prosperity and purity could coexist, while others simply chose not to examine the source of their comfort too closely. The wharves bustled with activity that would have horrified the colony's founders, yet the same men who profited from this trade filled the church pews every Sunday, seeking absolution for sins they had no intention of abandoning. Deacon Ezra Rutherford embodied this contradiction perfectly, though he alone among Providence's elite seemed genuinely tormented by it. By day, he was one of Providence's most respected religious leaders, a man whose sermons at the First Baptist Church could bring grown merchants to tears of repentance. His tall, gaunt frame, well over 6 feet in an age when most men barely reached 5.5, commanded attention before he even opened his mouth. His piercing gray eyes seemed to see through the careful facades that people constructed around their secret sins, and his voice carried the authority of someone who had wrestled with angels and emerged forever changed. He owned 3 merchant ships that plied the Caribbean routes: the Mercy, the Providence, and the Salvation, names that reflected his attempt to sanctify commerce that he knew contradicted his deepest beliefs. His mansion on Benefit Street displayed the fruits of his success in carefully chosen ways. Imported furniture that emphasized function over luxury, silver from London that served practical rather than decorative purposes, and books that filled an entire room with theological works in English, Latin, and Greek. Visitors noted that unlike other wealthy homes in Providence, The Rutherford mansion contained no frivolous ornaments, no paintings of landscapes or portraits that might encourage vanity. But prosperity troubled Ezra in ways that kept him awake through the long New England nights. He had witnessed firsthand the moral decay that accompanied wealth in Providence, and each success in his business ventures felt like another step away from the spiritual purity he desperately sought. Young men from respectable families spent their evenings in taverns along the waterfront, their laughter mixing with crude songs that drifted up from the docks like smoke from hell itself. Women wore increasingly elaborate dresses that, in Ezra's mind, displayed vanity rather than the modesty that marked a truly godly soul. Even the church seemed infected by worldliness. Members arrived in fine carriages that cost more than most families earned in a year, more interested in displaying their prosperity than listening to sermons about salvation and sacrifice. Conversations after services focused on business opportunities and social events rather than spiritual growth. Ezra began to suspect that he was the only person in Providence who truly understood how far they had all fallen from grace. His wife, Mercy, was 20 years his junior, a gentle soul with auburn hair that she kept modestly covered beneath a white cap that had belonged to her grandmother. She had married Ezra when she was barely 18, drawn to his reputation for godliness and his promise of a secure life, far from the poverty that had marked her childhood in the rural areas outside Providence. Her father had been a failed farmer who lost his land to creditors, and her mother had died of consumption when Mercy was only 14. For 5 years, their marriage had been blessed with abundance, but cursed with childlessness, a source of whispered speculation among Providence's gossips and private anguish for both husband and wife. Ezra interpreted their inability to conceive as a sign of God's displeasure with his involvement in worldly commerce, while Mercy blamed herself for sins she couldn't even name. They had consulted with Dr. Hamilton, the most respected physician in Providence, but his remedies of herbs and bloodletting had produced no results. The childlessness drove Ezra deeper into his theological studies and his increasingly frequent nights of wandering through Providence's darker districts. He told himself that he was studying sin in order to better combat it, but the truth was more complex and troubling. The taverns and brothels that served the waterfront community fascinated him precisely because they represented everything his faith taught him to reject. By observing the degradation of others, he could experience vicariously the freedom and abandon that his rigid self-control forbade him to enjoy directly. When Mercy finally conceived in the spring of 1762, Ezra saw it as divine vindication of his righteousness, proof that God had been testing his faith and found it sufficient. But as her pregnancy progressed through the humid summer months, something began to change in the deacon's demeanor. His sermons grew darker, filled with warnings about corruption seeping into innocent souls from the moment of birth. He spoke of children born pure, but immediately poisoned by the sinful world around them, their spiritual potential destroyed before they could even speak their first words. The transformation was subtle at first, noticed only by those who knew him best. Ezra began spending hours in prayer, often in the basement of their home, which he claimed offered the solitude necessary for deep communion with God. The basement was naturally quiet, its thick stone walls muffling the sounds of the city above, and Ezra found that the darkness helped him focus on spiritual matters without the distractions of visual stimuli. He started avoiding social gatherings, claiming that the frivolous conversations of Providence society were beneath a man seeking spiritual perfection. When pressed to attend church functions or business meetings, he would participate with obvious reluctance, his responses growing shorter and more pointed as the evening progressed. Mercy noticed how his eyes would follow children in the streets with an intensity that made her uncomfortable, as if he were studying some problem that required urgent solving. October 17th, 1762, dawned grey and cold, with the kind of Atlantic wind that cut through even the thickest wool and seemed to carry the promise of an early winter. The sky hung low over Providence Harbor, pressing down on the city like a grey shroud that muffled sound and made everything appear distant and dreamlike. Mercy's labor began before sunrise, announced by contractions that came with the regularity of church bells and the intensity of storm waves against the harbor breakwater. By the time Goodwife Prescott, the midwife, arrived with her leather satchel of herbs and instruments, the entire house seemed to pulse with an energy that felt both sacred and ominous. Servants had been dismissed for the day at Ezra's insistence. He claimed that childbirth was too sacred a process to be witnessed by hired hands, leaving only the 3 adults to manage what was clearly going to be a difficult delivery. Ezra paced the rooms above the birthing chamber, his footsteps creating a rhythm that matched Mercy's contractions and seemed to echo through the house's wooden frame like a heartbeat. He had been awake for 36 hours, alternating between prayer and restless movement, consuming nothing but water, and occasionally pausing to read passages from scripture that dealt with birth, blessing, and divine purpose. The labor progressed slowly, with Mercy fighting each contraction as if it were a personal enemy. Goodwife Prescott, who had delivered more children than she could count in her 40 years of practice, noted unusual aspects of this birth that she would remember for the rest of her life. The room seemed colder than it should have been despite the fire burning in the hearth, and shadows appeared to move in ways that had nothing to do with the flickering flames. When the first cry pierced the morning air at exactly 7 minutes past 9, Ezra fell to his knees in thanksgiving, his voice rising in a prayer of gratitude that could be heard throughout the house. But when Goodwife Prescott called out that there was a second child coming, something shifted in his expression. His grey eyes, already intense from sleeplessness and spiritual fervor, took on a quality that made the midwife unconsciously step back from the birthing bed. Twins were rare enough to be remarkable, often seen as either a great blessing or a terrible omen, depending on one's theological perspective and personal superstitions. In a community where every unusual event was scrutinized for divine meaning, the birth of twins to Providence's most prominent religious leader would inevitably become a subject of intense speculation and interpretation. Samuel Rutherford entered the world first, emerging with a lusty cry that announced his health and strength to everyone within hearing. He was perfectly formed, with dark hair that promised to match his father's and the robust build that suggested he would grow into a man capable of physical labor. His eyes, when they opened for the first time, were the deep blue that often characterized newborns but would eventually change to reflect his parentage. Judith followed 12 minutes later, her arrival more difficult but ultimately successful. She was smaller than her brother but equally healthy, with the auburn hair that marked her as her mother's daughter and delicate features that suggested she would grow into a beautiful woman. Her cry was softer than Samuel's but equally persistent, and she seemed to calm immediately when placed next to her twin brother. Goodwife Prescott, despite her decades of experience, was struck by the twins' immediate connection to each other. Most newborns showed little awareness of their surroundings, but Samuel and Judith seemed to respond to each other's presence in ways that went beyond simple proximity. When one cried, the other would turn toward the sound, and when placed together, they would automatically arrange themselves in positions that mirrored their arrangement in the womb. The midwife proclaimed them the finest twins she had delivered in 30 years of practice, healthy and strong despite the difficult labor. But as Ezra held his children for the first time, his joy was mixed with a terror that he shared with no one. Standing at the window of their bedroom, looking down at the bustling street below, he saw a group of young men stumbling home from the taverns, their clothes disheveled, their laughter crude and carrying undertones of mockery that seemed directed at everything sacred and pure. At that moment, a certainty settled over Ezra like a physical weight. The world below was no place for souls as pure as these. The children in his arms represented the ultimate test of his faith, the final opportunity to prove that corruption could be prevented rather than simply forgiven after the fact. Unlike every other parent in Providence, who would eventually watch their children's innocence erode through contact with worldly influences, Ezra had been given the chance to preserve purity indefinitely. The first sign of what was to come appeared 3 days after the birth, when Providence Society expected the formal announcement that would make the twins' arrival official and open the family home to the congratulatory visits that marked every significant birth. Instead of announcing the twins' arrival to the congregation as was customary, Ezra simply informed selected church members that Mercy was recovering from a difficult labor and that the children were still too fragile for visitors. This explanation bought him time to implement what he had begun calling, in his private prayers, his plan for preservation. The idea had come to him during those first nights of watching Samuel and Judith sleep, their faces unmarked by any knowledge of the corruption that surrounded them. Here was innocence in its purest form, untainted by exposure to the world's influence, and Ezra believed he had been chosen by divine providence to keep them in that state indefinitely. The basement of the Rutherford house was spacious, with stone walls that kept it cool in summer and could be warmed by careful use of braziers in winter. It extended beneath the entire main floor of the house, divided into several chambers that had served various purposes over the years. The largest room had functioned as Ezra's study and prayer room, filled with his theological books and a simple wooden cross he had carved himself during his first year of marriage. But now, as he stood in that familiar space 3 days after his children's birth, Ezra began to envision it as something more. A sanctuary where innocence could be preserved indefinitely, protected from the corruption that had claimed every other soul in Providence. The basement had natural advantages that he had never considered before. Thick walls that would muffle sound, limited access that could be controlled, and an atmosphere of solitude that would be perfect for spiritual contemplation and growth. Working in secret during the hours when Mercy slept with the exhaustion that followed difficult childbirth, Ezra began the careful process of converting the basement from a simple storage and study area into what he privately thought of as a sanctuary of preservation. The work required weeks of planning and execution, all conducted with the meticulous attention to detail that had made his merchant business successful. He started by installing oil lamps in protective alcoves carved into the stone walls, positioning them to provide gentle, consistent light that wouldn't strain developing eyes. The flames were designed to burn steadily without flickering, creating an environment of calm illumination that contrasted sharply with the harsh sunlight that Ezra had come to associate with worldly corruption. Each lamp was fitted with a metal reflector that directed light downward, preventing harsh shadows and creating what he believed was a more spiritually appropriate atmosphere. Next came the furniture, carefully selected and arranged to create a complete living environment below ground. He brought down the softest rugs from the upstairs rooms, Persian carpets that had cost him more than many Providence families earned in a year, and arranged them to create distinct areas for sleeping, eating, and prayer. Small beds were constructed from the finest pine, their frames carved with biblical verses that Ezra selected for their relevance to childhood innocence and spiritual purity. The sleeping area was positioned against the warmest wall, where heat from the kitchen fireplace above would provide consistent temperature throughout the long New England winters. Ezra installed a sophisticated system of air circulation that would keep the space comfortable without requiring windows that might tempt his children to look upon the corrupt world above. Fresh air entered through carefully concealed vents that could be controlled to maintain perfect atmospheric conditions. For meals, he created a dining area with a table sized perfectly for a small family, surrounded by chairs that could accommodate children as they grew from infancy to adulthood. The table was set permanently with simple but beautiful dishes, pewter plates and cups that reflected his belief that utility and godliness were more important than ostentation. A small altar occupied the place of honor in the room, where daily prayers would be conducted and scripture read aloud as part of the spiritual education that would replace the worldly learning available in Providence's schools. Books filled specially constructed shelves along one entire wall, but not just any books. Ezra had carefully curated a library that contained only the most spiritually pure writings, multiple translations of the Bible, the works of early church fathers, collections of hymns and spiritual poetry, and theological commentaries that supported his increasingly rigid interpretation of Christian doctrine. Notably absent were any works of secular literature, natural philosophy, or history that might introduce his children to ideas that contradicted their carefully controlled spiritual environment. When Mercy questioned why he was spending so much time below ground, often working through the night and emerging only for meals and essential business, Ezra explained that he was preparing a special nursery where the twins could grow strong away from the drafts and noise of the main house. The basement, he assured her, would keep them safe from the cold autumn winds and the diseases that often struck newborns in Providence's harsh climate. His explanation was convincing because it contained elements of truth. The basement was indeed warmer and quieter than the upper floors, and infant mortality was a genuine concern in colonial New England. What Ezra didn't reveal was his deeper purpose, his growing conviction that his children needed protection not from physical dangers, but from spiritual contamination that could only be prevented through complete isolation from the world above. As November arrived with its early darkness and the kind of cold that seemed to seep through the bones of even the sturdiest houses, Ezra's plan moved into its second phase. He began working to convince Mercy that the twins needed complete quiet to develop properly, and that the constant stream of well-wishers expected after any birth would disturb their delicate constitutions and potentially expose them to illnesses that could prove fatal. The argument was persuasive because it aligned with medical wisdom of the time. Dr. Hamilton himself had recommended limiting visitors during the first months of life, and several prominent families in Providence had lost infants to illnesses that seemed to arrive with well-meaning friends and relatives. More importantly, Ezra argued, exposure to the outside world could introduce not just physical diseases, but spiritual influences that might corrupt his children's developing souls. Mercy, exhausted from childbirth and trusting her husband's wisdom in all matters of faith and family, found herself agreeing to keep the twins secluded for what Ezra initially described as a few weeks. She was still recovering her strength and actually welcomed the excuse to avoid the social obligations that came with new motherhood. The formal visits, the careful conversations about child-rearing theories, and the subtle competitions that marked interactions between mothers in Providence's social elite. The basement nursery, when Ezra finally revealed it to her in its completed form, was indeed beautiful. The space was warm and inviting, filled with everything the babies might need and appointed with a luxury that rivaled the finest homes in Providence. Oil lamps provided steady illumination. Carefully selected books promised hours of spiritual enrichment, and the altar created a focal point for the daily prayers that Ezra insisted were essential for proper spiritual development. What Mercy didn't immediately realize was how carefully Ezra had planned every detail of the space's isolation. The basement had only one entrance, through a heavy oak door that could be secured from the outside with iron bars and a lock that only Ezra possessed. The windows were small and set high in the walls, providing some light and air circulation, but preventing anyone inside from seeing out clearly or communicating easily with people above ground. Most importantly, the thick stone walls that made the basement so comfortable also served to muffle sound completely. Conversations held in normal tones couldn't be heard above ground, and even loud crying or shouting would be reduced to faint murmurs that could easily be attributed to wind or settling timber. The acoustic isolation that made the space perfect for prayer and contemplation also made it an ideal prison. The first month of their basement life passed peacefully enough, creating an illusion of normalcy that allowed Mercy to convince herself that her husband's unusual arrangements were temporary and ultimately beneficial. She spent most of her waking hours in the converted space, nursing Samuel and Judith and marveling at how quickly they seemed to be developing. The twins were thriving in ways that exceeded her expectations, gaining weight steadily and showing the kind of alertness that suggested exceptional intelligence. Ezra would join them for morning and evening prayers, his deep voice filling the stone chamber as he read from Scripture, and offered thanks to God for the gift of untainted souls. His prayers during this period were beautiful and moving, filled with genuine gratitude and a father's love that seemed to transform the basement into a genuinely sacred space. He began teaching the twins hymns before they could even focus their eyes properly, convinced that sacred music would shape their spirits from the earliest moments of consciousness. The daily routine that emerged during this first month felt almost normal, if somewhat isolated. Mercy would wake with the twins for their early morning feeding, then join Ezra for breakfast in the basement dining area. He would read Scripture aloud while they ate simple but nourishing meals, then conduct a brief prayer service before leaving to attend to his business affairs above ground. Mercy would spend the day caring for the children, reading from the carefully selected books, and maintaining the living space that had become their entire world. But as winter deepened and the brief daylight hours grew even shorter, subtle changes began to appear in Ezra's behavior and his expectations for their underground life. His restrictions became more pronounced, reflecting an evolving theology that grew increasingly rigid with each passing week. He decided that Mercy was spending too much time upstairs, exposing herself to the corrupting influences of the outside world before returning to their pure children, potentially carrying spiritual contamination that could undo all their careful work. It would be better, he explained during one of their evening prayer sessions, if Mercy remained in the basement as much as possible, serving as a constant barrier between the twins and any worldly contamination that might seep down from the floors above. The house servants, he pointed out, were necessary for maintaining their business and social obligations, but their presence in the upper floors meant that worldly influences were constantly present in their home. At first, Mercy found practical excuses to go upstairs, preparing special meals for the twins as they began to eat solid food, tending to household duties that couldn't be delegated to servants, maintaining correspondence with family members who lived outside Providence. But Ezra grew increasingly agitated each time she left the basement, pacing the stone floor and muttering prayers until she returned. His relief when she came back was so obvious and intense that she began to feel guilty about leaving at all. The meals that had once been elaborate affairs featuring the best ingredients his merchant business could provide became increasingly simple and spare. Ezra began to suggest that perhaps their diet should be simplified, focused on basic sustenance rather than the elaborate meals that encouraged gluttony and distracted from spiritual contemplation. Simple bread, milk and water were sufficient for those seeking spiritual purity, he argued, and the time saved from food preparation could be better spent in prayer and scripture study. The isolation affected Mercy more than she initially realized, in ways that were subtle but cumulative. Cut off from her friends, her family, and even casual contact with neighbors, she began to depend entirely on Ezra for news of the outside world. And the news he brought was consistently disturbing. Reports of moral decay spreading through Providence, stories of children corrupted by worldly influences before they could even walk properly, warnings about spiritual dangers that seemed to be growing more severe with each passing day. According to Ezra's increasingly frequent reports, conditions above ground were deteriorating rapidly. Families that had once been pillars of the community were falling into sin and degradation. Children were learning to lie and steal almost as soon as they could talk. Even the church was being infected by worldly concerns that distracted from true spiritual growth. Each piece of news reinforced his arguments about the necessity of keeping Samuel and Judith protected from influences that could destroy their spiritual potential in a matter of hours. But while Ezra preached purity and spiritual protection within the confines of their basement sanctuary, he was conducting very different activities in the world above. Activities that were growing increasingly disturbing and dangerous with each passing month. What the residents of Providence couldn't understand were the changes in Deacon Rutherford's behavior during his public appearances throughout that winter and into the spring of 1763. The man who had once been known for his compassionate counsel to troubled parishioners now seemed to study people with clinical detachment, as if cataloguing their sins for some private purpose that he shared with no one. His sermons took on an increasingly urgent and unsettling tone, filled with vivid descriptions of corruption seeping into innocent souls and the heroic measures that true Christians must take to preserve purity in a fallen world. He spoke of children as vessels that could be filled with either righteousness or sin, with no middle ground possible. Parents who failed to take extreme measures to protect their children from worldly influence were, in his view, collaborating in their spiritual destruction. More disturbing were the practical steps Ezra began taking in his quest to understand and document the process of moral corruption. He started visiting the waterfront taverns not as a reformer seeking to save souls, but as an observer, documenting the depths of human depravity with scientific precision. Night after night, he would sit in dark corners of establishments that respectable men avoided, watching drunken sailors and listening to conversations that would have horrified his congregation. These expeditions served a dual purpose that Ezra revealed to no one, not even in his private journal entries. While he genuinely believed he was studying sin to better understand how to protect his children from it, he was also satisfying darker impulses that his rigid self-control had suppressed for years. The taverns offered him vicarious experiences of the freedom and abandon that his faith forbade him to enjoy directly, allowing him to witness depravity without technically participating in it. But observation wasn't enough to satisfy his growing obsession with understanding corruption. Ezra began conducting what he privately called experiments in moral degradation, carefully orchestrated encounters designed to test the spiritual boundaries of Providence's citizens and document exactly how quickly good people could be led into sin when faced with the right temptations. He would approach struggling families with offers of financial assistance, then watch carefully to see if desperation would drive them to compromise their principles. A widow struggling to feed her children might find anonymous gifts of money left at her door, but only after Ezra had observed her stealing scraps from market vendors to keep her family alive. The assistance would continue as long as she continued stealing, creating a cycle of dependency that proved his theories about the relationship between need and moral compromise. Young men with gambling debts found themselves approached by a well-dressed stranger who offered loans at reasonable rates, with no questions asked about their ability to repay. Ezra would then follow these men through Providence's streets, documenting how quickly they fell deeper into vice once they had access to easy money. Some gambled away the loans within days. Others spent the money on alcohol and prostitutes, but all of them proved his thesis, that corruption, once introduced into a soul, spread rapidly until it consumed everything pure and decent. Most unsettling were his interactions with children, encounters that he justified as research into the process of spiritual contamination, but that revealed increasingly dangerous aspects of his psychological state. Under the guise of religious instruction, Ezra would visit families with young children, ostensibly to provide spiritual guidance and support for their Christian education. But these visits became opportunities for him to study how quickly innocence could be corrupted by exposure to ideas that challenged parental authority or introduced doubts about established religious doctrine. He would tell children carefully crafted stories designed to plant seeds of doubt about their parents' wisdom, then return weeks later to observe the results of his psychological manipulation. The children he targeted were selected carefully, those from families struggling with financial difficulties, those whose parents worked long hours and couldn't provide constant supervision, those who showed signs of curiosity about the world beyond their immediate experience. Ezra would gain their trust through small gifts and patient attention, then gradually introduce concepts that undermined their simple faith and trust in adult authority. Spring arrived in Providence with the usual bustle of ships returning from winter voyages and merchants preparing for the busy trading season ahead. But inside the Rutherford basement, seasons had lost all meaning. The twins, now 6 months old, and developing at a rate that both fascinated and alarmed their father, were beginning to show the effects of their unnatural environment in ways that confirmed Ezra's theories, while simultaneously revealing their horrifying implications. Samuel and Judith had developed an uncanny ability to communicate with each other through sounds and gestures that bore no resemblance to normal infant development. Having been exposed primarily to their father's scriptural recitations and their mother's increasingly desperate lullabies, their first sounds weren't the typical baby babbling that marked healthy development, but strange approximations of the hymns and prayers they heard constantly throughout each day. More disturbing was their reaction to the rare moments when Ezra would light additional oil lamps to brighten their underground world. Instead of the natural curiosity that most children show toward light and visual stimulation, the twins would cry and cover their faces with their tiny hands, their eyes having adapted to the perpetual dimness of their basement prison. This reaction confirmed Ezra's growing belief that he had successfully created children untouched by the corruption that light, particularly sunlight, represented in his increasingly twisted theology. The twins' physical development was proceeding normally in most respects, but their social and emotional growth was following patterns that no child psychologist of any era would have recognized as healthy. Having never experienced interaction with anyone except their parents, they showed no curiosity about other people, no desire to explore beyond the confines of their stone chamber, and no distress at the isolation that would have driven normal children to desperate attempts at escape. Most remarkably, they seemed perfectly content with their underground existence, playing with simple toys that Ezra had carved from wood and listening for hours to the theological discussions that filled their days. To their father, this contentment was proof that his methods had succeeded, that he had created children untouched by the restlessness and discontent that marked all other human beings. They were, in his mind, living proof that innocence could be preserved indefinitely through proper isolation and spiritual guidance. But Ezra's nocturnal experiments in Providence were becoming increasingly dangerous and erratic, reflecting a psychological deterioration that was accelerating as his isolation from normal human contact deepened. His careful documentation of sin had evolved into active participation in the very corruption he claimed to oppose, though he continued to justify his actions as necessary research into the nature of moral decay. He had begun providing financial backing for gambling operations throughout the waterfront district, not for profit, but to study how quickly good men could be destroyed by vice when given unlimited access to temptation. His money funded drinking sessions for groups of young sailors. Then he would follow them through the streets of Providence, documenting their descent into chaos while feeling both disgust and a terrible fascination with their loss of control. The most disturbing aspect of these activities was how they were beginning to affect his interactions with his own family. The hours he spent observing human degradation were changing his perspective on human nature itself, convincing him that corruption was not just possible but inevitable for anyone exposed to worldly influences. This belief reinforced his determination to keep Samuel and Judith isolated, but it also made him increasingly suspicious of his wife's spiritual purity. Mercy's isolation in the basement was taking a severe toll on her mental and physical health, though the decline was so gradual that neither she nor Ezra fully recognized its extent. She had begun losing weight despite adequate food, and her complexion had taken on the pallor that marked people who spent too much time away from sunlight. More troubling were the psychological changes that were becoming apparent to anyone who looked closely. She had started talking to herself during the long hours when Ezra was away conducting his business above ground, carrying on elaborate conversations with imaginary visitors who brought news from the world she was no longer allowed to see. Sometimes she would describe social events in great detail, discussing the dresses worn by women who existed only in her memory and the conversations she imagined having with friends who had long since stopped asking about her welfare. The twins seemed to sense their mother's deteriorating condition in ways that were both touching and deeply unsettling. They had begun crying in unison at specific times each day, creating harmonies that echoed strangely in the stone chamber and seemed to respond to emotional states that they were too young to understand rationally. Mercy interpreted this synchronized crying as singing, convinced that her children were displaying the pure, spiritual nature their father had promised to preserve. But to anyone with experience in child development, the sounds would have been deeply alarming, more like the ritualistic chanting that marked certain religious ceremonies than the natural expressions of infant distress or contentment. The twins were learning to communicate through patterns that had been shaped entirely by their father's theological obsessions, creating a private language that reflected the abnormal environment in which they were developing. It was during one of these episodes that the first crack appeared in Ezra's carefully constructed world. Returning from a particularly disturbing night, observing the corruption of a young merchant son who had fallen into gambling debts that would eventually destroy his family, Ezra descended into the basement to find Mercy teaching the twins what she called the Darkness Song, a wordless melody that she claimed had come to her in a divine vision. The sight of his wife and children swaying together in the dim light of the oil lamps, creating sounds that seemed to come from some place beyond human experience, should have alarmed any rational observer. The melody had no recognizable structure, the rhythm followed no pattern that related to normal music, and the words, when they could be discerned, were combinations of biblical phrases that had been rearranged into sequences that made no theological sense. Instead of recognizing this behavior as evidence of psychological breakdown, Ezra felt a terrible joy spreading through his chest. Here was proof that his methods were working beyond his wildest expectations, that isolation from worldly corruption could indeed preserve and even enhance spiritual purity. His family was developing abilities that transcended normal human limitations, reaching levels of spiritual communion that he had only dreamed possible. But this joy was mixed with a growing paranoia about the outside world's potential to discover and destroy his perfect sanctuary. During his ventures into Providence, Ezra had begun to notice people watching him with what he interpreted as suspicion and hostility. Neighbors who had once greeted him warmly now seemed to whisper when he passed, their conversations stopping abruptly when he came within hearing distance. Church members asked increasingly uncomfortable questions about his family's continued absence from services, their concern disguised as friendly interest but carrying undertones that suggested doubt about his explanations. Business associates mentioned the twins less frequently, but when they did, their questions carried implications that made Ezra wonder if someone was investigating his private affairs. Most disturbing of all were the children he encountered during his daily activities. They seemed to watch him with expressions that suggested knowledge beyond their years, and their games sometimes included references to sounds coming from beneath the ground, references that could only mean his basement sanctuary was not as perfectly concealed as he had believed. The growing scrutiny from the outside world convinced Ezra that he needed to take more drastic measures to protect his family's spiritual development. But the actions he was contemplating would transform their basement sanctuary into something far more sinister than anything he had originally envisioned. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in the Rutherford basement intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next in this tale of faith twisted beyond recognition. The growing scrutiny from the outside world convinced Ezra that he needed to take more drastic measures to protect his family's purity. But the actions he was contemplating would transform their basement sanctuary into something far more sinister than anything Providence had ever witnessed. The breaking point came on a humid July evening in 1763, when the twins were 9 months old, and their development had reached a stage that both fascinated and terrified their father. The basement that had once felt spacious now seemed smaller, filled with the energy of 2 active children who were beginning to crawl and explore their limited environment with the methodical thoroughness that marked their unusual upbringing. Samuel had grown into a robust infant whose pale skin seemed almost translucent in the lamplight. his dark hair contrasting sharply with eyes that had adapted to perpetual dimness until they appeared almost black in normal illumination. Judith remained smaller but equally alert, her auburn hair now long enough to require the careful braiding that Mercy performed each morning as part of their daily routine. Both children moved with a strange precision that suggested unusual coordination, navigating their underground world with the confidence of creatures perfectly adapted to their environment. More unsettling was their continued development of the private communication system that had replaced normal language acquisition. They would sit facing each other for hours, creating complex patterns of sound and gesture that appeared to convey specific meanings. When one twin wanted something, the other would often respond by providing it before any adult could interpret the need. Their synchronization extended to sleep patterns, feeding schedules, and even emotional responses that seemed to transcend individual consciousness. It was on this particular evening that Goodwife Prescott, the midwife who had delivered Samuel and Judith, appeared at the Rutherford door with a basket of herbs and an expression of determined concern. She had been hearing disturbing rumors about the family's continued isolation for nearly 10 months. Whispers that suggested the twins had never been seen by anyone outside the immediate family. Her professional conscience would no longer allow her to ignore what was clearly an unprecedented situation in her decades of experience. The old woman had spent weeks gathering information from various sources throughout Providence, piecing together a picture that troubled her deeply. Merchants reported that Ezra's orders for household supplies had decreased dramatically, suggesting fewer people living in the house than expected. Servants who had worked for the family spoke of strange sounds coming from below ground and instructions never to enter certain areas of the basement. Most disturbing were reports from neighbors of children's voices that seemed to come from beneath the earth itself, singing songs that bore no resemblance to any hymns known in Providence's churches. Ezra met her at the door with his usual cordial demeanor, but Goodwife Prescott was too experienced in dealing with difficult families to be deflected by social pleasantries. She had delivered most of the children in Providence and considered herself responsible for their welfare long after birth. Her reputation for plain speaking and stubborn determination was legendary, and she had no intention of being turned away by evasive explanations. She demanded to see Mercy and the children immediately, insisting that professional obligation required her to check on their health and development after such an extended period without outside contact. When Ezra attempted to turn her away with excuses about the late hour and his family's need for rest, she threatened to return the following day with Dr. Hamilton and several church deacons, creating exactly the kind of official scrutiny that Ezra had been desperately trying to avoid. Faced with the prospect of unwanted attention from multiple authorities who would not be satisfied with simple explanations, Ezra made a decision that revealed just how far his rationality had deteriorated over the months of isolation and obsessive theological speculation. Instead of allowing her to see the twins and potentially exposing his carefully constructed sanctuary to outside interference, he invited Goodwife Prescott inside with the intention of convincing her to abandon her concerns permanently. He led her not to the basement, but to the main parlor, where he began what he later described in his private journal as a test of her spiritual worthiness to enter our sanctuary. O.D. For over an hour, Ezra subjected the elderly woman to an interrogation disguised as theological discussion, questioning her about her faith, her understanding of sin and corruption, and her commitment to preserving innocence in a world that seemed determined to destroy purity wherever it could be found. The conversation revealed the full extent of Ezra's psychological deterioration. He spoke of children as vessels that could be filled with either perfect righteousness or complete corruption, with no possibility of partial contamination or gradual moral development. He described Providence as a city under siege by forces of spiritual darkness that were actively working to corrupt every innocent soul they could reach. Most disturbing of all, he outlined his theories about the necessity of complete isolation to preserve purity, speaking with the fervor of someone who had discovered ultimate truth. Goodwife Prescott, meanwhile, was becoming increasingly alarmed by Ezra's intensity and the strange theological ideas he was expounding with such passionate conviction. His questions about her interactions with other families in Providence seemed designed to catalogue her potential for spiritual contamination rather than assess her qualifications as a midwife. When she attempted to redirect the conversation toward practical matters of child health and development, he dismissed her concerns as evidence of worldly thinking that prioritized physical well-being over spiritual purity. The confrontation escalated when Goodwife Prescott finally lost patience with theological discussion and attempted to push past Ezra toward the basement door, which she had correctly identified as the source of the sounds that had been troubling neighbors for months. Her maternal instincts, honed by decades of caring for children, told her that something was seriously wrong in the Rutherford household, and her professional obligations demanded that she investigate regardless of the theological obstacles Ezra was placing in her path. The struggle that followed was brief but decisive, representing the moment when Ezra's carefully maintained facade of respectability finally collapsed completely. In his journal, he described what happened next as divine intervention, protecting the sanctuary from contamination. But the truth was far more disturbing. In his paranoid state, Ezra genuinely believed that allowing any outsider into the basement would introduce spiritual corruption that would undo months of careful work preserving his children's innocence. Goodwife Prescott, despite her age and small stature, fought with the desperation of someone who had finally understood the true nature of the situation she had stumbled into. Her experience with difficult births had given her physical strength that most people wouldn't expect from a woman in her 60s, and her determination to protect the children she suspected were in danger drove her to resist with surprising effectiveness. But Ezra's years of physical labor managing his merchant ships, combined with the desperate strength that comes from protecting what one considers most sacred, proved superior to the elderly woman's courage and determination. The struggle ended when Goodwife Prescott struck her head against the stone hearth of the parlor fireplace, the sound echoing through the house like a judgment that sealed both their fates. Standing over her motionless body, Ezra faced a choice that would define the final phase of his descent into complete madness. He could summon help, claim that an accident had occurred during an innocent visit, and face the investigation that would surely follow. The constables would ask questions, neighbors would be interviewed, and eventually someone would demand to see the twins whose continued absence from normal social life had already attracted dangerous attention. Or he could protect his family's sanctuary by ensuring that the outside world never learned what Goodwife Prescott had discovered or suspected. The decision, when it came, felt to Ezra like divine guidance, a clear indication that God was directing him to take whatever steps were necessary to preserve the innocence he had worked so hard to maintain. He carried the midwife's body to his merchant warehouse near the harbor, where it would eventually be discovered and attributed to the random violence that sometimes befell elderly people venturing out alone after dark. The murder had consequences that extended far beyond Ezra's immediate concerns about discovery. The experience of taking a life to protect his family's spiritual purity created a precedent in his mind, a justification for increasingly extreme measures that would eventually consume everything he claimed to be preserving. More immediately, it meant that the one person in Providence who had actively suspected problems in the Rutherford household was no longer able to pursue her concerns. Providence's constables, already overwhelmed by crimes associated with the busy harbor and the transient population that came with maritime commerce, conducted only a cursory investigation before concluding that Goodwife Prescott had been robbed and killed by sailors or drifters. Her reputation for carrying medical supplies and occasionally treating patients who paid in silver made her a plausible target for robbery, and the lack of witnesses near the warehouse district where her body was found supported the theory of random crime. But the twins, now approaching their first birthday, were developing in ways that both thrilled and terrified their father in equal measure. Their communication with each other had evolved into complex patterns of sound and gesture that seemed to bypass normal language development entirely, creating what appeared to be a private language that served all their communicative needs. They could navigate the basement in complete darkness with the confidence of creatures perfectly adapted to their environment, their other senses compensating for the limited visual stimulation they had experienced. Most remarkably, from Ezra's perspective, they showed no distress at their isolation from the world above. Having never experienced sunlight, fresh air, or social contact beyond their parents, Samuel and Judith seemed perfectly content with their underground existence, playing with simple wooden toys and listening with apparent interest to the theological discussions that filled their days. To their father, this contentment was final proof that his methods had succeeded, that he had created children untouched by the restlessness and spiritual corruption that contaminated every other human being. But Mercy's condition continued to deteriorate in ways that were becoming impossible for even Ezra to ignore or rationalize. The combination of poor nutrition, constant darkness, and complete social isolation had broken something fundamental in her psychological structure. She had begun having elaborate conversations with people who existed only in her imagination, describing social events and family gatherings that grew more detailed and fantastical with each passing day. Sometimes she would dress carefully for church services that would never come, sitting patiently by the basement door, waiting for her husband to escort her to worship that had been forbidden for over a year. Other times she would prepare elaborate meals for guests who lived only in her memory, setting places at their simple table for friends and family members who had long since stopped asking about her welfare. The twins seemed to sense their mother's deteriorating condition in ways that were both touching and deeply unsettling. They had begun responding to her imaginary conversations as if the invisible people she described were actually present, nodding and making sounds at appropriate moments in discussions they couldn't possibly understand. Their willingness to participate in their mother's delusions suggested either remarkable empathy for her condition or their own developing disconnection from reality. The final phase of the Rutherford family tragedy began in the autumn of 1764, when Ezra's theological obsessions reached a conclusion that was both logical and utterly insane. He had become convinced, through months of observation and prayer, that even his own presence in the basement was introducing contamination that threatened to undo all his careful work. His nightly ventures into Providence's underworld, necessary though they were for understanding the nature of corruption, had exposed him to levels of spiritual poison that made him unfit to share the purified environment he had created for his family. The realization came to him during one of his lengthy prayer sessions, when he suddenly understood that his children's perfect innocence was being gradually compromised by contact with a father who had deliberately exposed himself to the worst aspects of human nature. Every conversation, every shared meal, every moment of physical contact was potentially transferring spiritual contamination that could destroy their purity in ways too subtle to detect until it was too late. The solution, as it appeared to Ezra during a night of particularly intense theological contemplation, was elegantly simple and utterly terrifying in its implications. He would seal the basement from the outside, ensuring that no further contamination could reach his wife and children, while providing them with everything they needed for spiritual sustenance. They had prayer, scripture, and each other's pure company. What more could genuinely spiritual beings require? Physical needs, Ezra had come to believe, were secondary to spiritual preservation, distractions that prevented souls from achieving their full potential for communion with divine truth. If God willed their earthly bodies to perish, while their souls remained untainted, that was a sacrifice worth making to preserve innocence that could never be recovered once lost to worldly corruption. Ezra's final journal entries, discovered decades later during renovation of the house, described his decision in terms of ultimate parental love and spiritual responsibility. He was giving his children the greatest gift imaginable: eternal preservation from corruption, guaranteed innocence that would endure beyond physical death. and the certainty of salvation that came from never having been exposed to the temptations that destroyed other souls. The sealed basement would become their tomb, but also their salvation, a place where purity could exist indefinitely, unmarked by the compromises and moral failures that marked every other human life. In death, if death came, they would remain as innocent as the moment of their birth, their souls untouched by the spiritual poison that had corrupted every other resident of Providence. The physical act of sealing the basement was accomplished over several nights in January 1765 during a period of bitter cold that kept most of Providence's residents indoors and provided cover for Ezra's activities. Working with the methodical precision that had made his merchant business successful, he installed heavy timber beams across the basement door, then sealed every gap with mortar and plaster until no sign remained that an entrance had ever existed. The windows that had provided limited ventilation were blocked and redirected, ensuring that the basement would become completely isolated from the outside world, while maintaining the illusion that nothing had changed in the house's external appearance. Ezra's knowledge of construction, gained through years of maintaining his merchant properties, allowed him to create a seal that would be virtually impossible to detect without deliberate investigation. For weeks afterward, neighbors reported increasingly disturbing sounds coming from beneath the Rutherford house, muffled crying that seemed to come from deep underground, scraping noises that suggested desperate attempts to break through stone walls, and what some described as singing in languages that bore no resemblance to any Christian hymns. The sounds would begin at sunset and continue until dawn, creating melodies that made listeners cross themselves and hurry past the house with their children held close. But Ezra, when questioned by concerned neighbors, explained these sounds with the calm authority of someone who understood their true spiritual significance. The noises were settling timber responding to winter temperature changes, wind moving through the house's older sections, and perhaps mice or rats moving within the walls, perfectly natural phenomena that worried people were misinterpreting because of their own spiritual inadequacies. The truth was more horrible than any neighbor could have imagined. Trapped in their basement sanctuary with no ventilation, rapidly diminishing food supplies, and no possibility of escape, Mercy and the twins were facing a slow death that Ezra had convinced himself represented spiritual transcendence. His final acts of paternal love had transformed their refuge into a tomb where innocence would indeed be preserved, but only because life itself was ending. The psychological torture of their situation was perhaps worse than the physical deprivation. Mercy, already fragile from months of isolation, began to understand that their imprisonment was deliberate and permanent. Her conversations with imaginary visitors became increasingly frantic as she realized that no real help would ever come. The twins, too young to understand death but old enough to sense their mother's terror, responded with the synchronized crying that had become their signature form of communication. Ezra continued his public life in Providence for another month, attending church services and conducting business as if nothing had changed. But the strain of maintaining normalcy while knowing what was happening beneath his house began to show in ways that even his iron self-control couldn't conceal. He would sometimes be found standing outside his house at night, listening to sounds that others couldn't hear and carrying on conversations with family members who were slowly dying in the sealed chamber below. The psychological pressure of his situation created a final crisis that resolved the contradiction between his public persona and private reality. During a church service in late February, Ezra experienced what he described as a divine revelation, directing him to join his family in their purified state. The outside world had nothing more to offer someone who had achieved perfect understanding of spiritual truth, and his continued presence in Providence was an unnecessary compromise with corruption that he could no longer justify. The end came when Ezra, in a moment of what he called divine revelation, decided to join his family in their purified state. He unsealed the basement door just long enough to descend into the darkness below, carrying with him the oil and materials needed to reseal the entrance permanently. His final act was to ensure that no trace of the door remained visible, creating a perfect tomb where the Rutherford family would achieve the spiritual purity that had eluded every other soul in Providence. Providence authorities discovered the truth only when Ezra's business partners, concerned about his sudden disappearance and the growing rumors surrounding his family, forced entry into the house in March 1765. The investigation that followed revealed evidence of deliberate imprisonment and slow murder that challenged every assumption about parental love and religious devotion. The basement, when finally opened, contained the remains of a family that had died not from accident or illness, but from the methodical implementation of theological theories that transformed love into torture. The official story, carefully crafted to protect Providence's reputation and avoid scandal that might affect commerce, claimed that the Rutherford family had died in a tragic accident involving a basement collapse during the severe winter of 1764-1765. But those who discovered the scene knew better. The carefully constructed isolation chamber, the religious artifacts, and the condition of the bodies told a story of deliberate imprisonment and slow death that would haunt everyone involved for the rest of their lives. The Rutherford house stood empty for years afterward, as no family could remain there for more than a few weeks without reporting phenomena that made residence impossible. The sounds of children singing continued to emanate from sealed walls. The smell of oil lamps burning in spaces where no lamps existed filled rooms at random hours, and visitors reported the sensation of small hands touching their ankles when they walked across floors beneath which the basement chamber lay hidden. This mystery shows us how the purest intentions can become the most dangerous obsessions when isolated from human connection and rational guidance. The basement that Ezra Rutherford created as a sanctuary for innocence became a tomb for the very purity he sought to preserve, proving that love without wisdom can become the cruelest form of destruction. What do you think of this story? Do you believe a father's devotion could become so twisted by religious extremism that he would murder his own family to save their souls? Leave your comment below and share your thoughts about where the line between protection and imprisonment truly lies. If you enjoyed this tale of faith corrupted by isolation and obsession, subscribe to our channel, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who appreciates the darker corners of human psychology. Until next time, remember that sometimes the most terrifying monsters are those who believe they're saving souls while destroying everything they claim to love.